Before we get into the video proper, I want to give a full spoiler warning for Neo The World Ends With You. The game is one of my personal favorites, and if you have any intention of playing it whatsoever, I would highly recommend doing so before watching this video. If you don't care about spoilers, then you can watch the video, realize how good the game is, and go play it afterwards. Also, on an unrelated note, usually I'm not too picky with the B-roll I use in my videos. Heck, sometimes I'll even use B-rolls from games other than the one I'm talking about. But since this is a video essay, I'll be using specific clips to refer to the different scenes I'm discussing instead of quoting the game verbally. In other words, if you're someone who likes to watch your videos instead of just listening to them, there's a benefit to doing that this time. Thank you, and now, on with the feature. Neo The World Ends With You has a stellar cast of characters, but the one character that stood out to me the most when I first played the game back around its release in 2021 was Shoka Sakurane. Such an impression has persisted throughout my following 2 replays of the game, as well as the rereading of selective cutscenes I did in order to make this video. Shoka is often highlighted for having one of the strongest character arcs in the game, with her gradual abandonment of the Shinjuku Reapers in favor of aiding the main party being a major plot point towards the end of the game. However, I never necessarily saw these plot developments as symbols of Shoka's character growth. The way I saw it on my initial playthrough of the game, Shoka didn't so much develop as much as she revealed her true colors. For you see, Shoka's joining the party is not the only major Shoka-related plot development towards the end of the game, as she is also revealed to be Rindo's online friend Swallow. Said reveal heavily informed my thoughts on Shoka's arc during my first playthrough, as Swallow spends the entirety of the game's first half being nothing but supportive of Rindo and the Wicked Twisters. Though Swallow notably lacks Shoka's characteristic sass, a fact I initially found a bit hard to reconcile, but we'll get back to that later, Swallow's overall MO is consistent with Shoka's character, as Shoka herself makes no secret of her personal discontent regarding the way the game is currently being conducted. Despite her constant derision of the Wicked Twisters, she would still much rather them win than the Ruin Bringers. After all, even through all the sarcasm, she still manages to slip the Twisters secrets and tips in person, just under the guise of throwing them a bone every once in a while. See Nagi and Beats Recruitment Days for specific examples. If you'll forgive me for getting sidetracked for a brief moment in order to further illustrate my point, Neo The World Ends With You, taking advantage of its unique comic book style cutscenes, often does something during character interactions that I'm rather fond of. While it is fairly common for JRPGs to have character portraits that change mid-conversation based on how the speaker is feeling, what is less common is having every character participating in the conversation change portraits in reaction to what the other characters say, even if they themselves are not the ones talking. There are a number of scenes, particularly during Week 2, where Shoka visibly appears anywhere from disappointed to devastated, when the mission results are read off and it is revealed that the Ruin Bringers are still in first despite the Twisters' continued success throughout the week. It's patterns like these, alongside specific actions Shoka takes throughout the game, like her bribing of the Wall Reapers on Week 2 Day 5, that initially led me to believe that describing Shoka's progression throughout the game as development was something of a misnomer, and that she had already lost most of her loyalty to the Shinjuku Reapers by the time the game begins. Upon further examination, though, I realized that my initial interpretation of events was at least somewhat incomplete, as it fails to explain why Shoka would wait so long to do anything if she was already against the Shinjuku Reapers to begin with. For that, I would propose that in fact, Shoka's character arc is in parallel to Rindo's. To explain how, I want to dive a little deeper into Shoka's position as a Shinjuku Reaper. Shoka initially joined the Reapers, not necessarily because she was chomping at the bit to do so, but mostly because it beat the alternative. Shoka's life prior to the events of the story is left entirely in the subtext and /or up to the player's interpretation, but, without going too much into specifics, mostly to avoid parroting other people's interpretations, it's clear that Shoka didn't feel very in control of her life prior to joining the Reapers. She mentions the feeling of power she got from using psychs in the underground as something that drew her to join the Reapers. However, that power did not equate to freedom and control as she may have hoped. By joining the Reapers, she entered into their hierarchy, a hierarchy she never got particularly high up in. Still, this hierarchy evidently managed to provide more support systems than whatever it was she had before, as she opted to remain within the system for 4 whole years. These supports took the form of the friends she made within her circle of coworkers. For the purposes of this discussion, there are 4 other characters I'd like to focus on: Ayano, Susukichi, Kaie, and Shiba. Ayano was the first Shinjuku Reaper that Shoka really connected with, and though admittedly the game doesn't actually show us very much of their relationship prior to their arrival in Shibuya, it's clear that they care a great deal about each other. However, as Ayano begins to socially withdraw, unable to fully adjust to their new environment, she becomes more possessive over Shoka. Shoka does not want to acquiesce to Ayano's every command, but she does not want to fully abandon her friend either, and thus Shoka takes to going behind Ayano's back more and more as the story proceeds in the hopes of avoiding conflict. Then there's Susukichi. We perhaps get even less of Shoka and Susukichi's relationship than we do of Shoka and Ayano's, but what we do get ties back into the central idea of support. Shoka refers to Susukichi as Big Stu, a term of endearment indicating that she sees him as someone she can turn to when she needs help or guidance. The main difference between him and Ayano is that whereas Ayano became possessive upon their arrival in Shibuya, Susukichi backed off entirely, pretending to submit to Shiba in the hopes of eventually taking him down. Shoka's relationship with Kai is interesting, because the game doesn't really put a lot of emphasis on it, but he actually provides Shoka the most direct support out of anyone in the Shinjuku Reapers. First and foremost, Kai is the one who created the Swallow persona for Shoka to use, observing her to be somewhat lonely, another observation that we will get back to later, and hoping that through it, she might make a friend. Second, and this one is pretty subtle, but during Week 2 Day 5, when Shoka bribes the Wall Reapers to make the day's mission easier, Kai notably appears to offer assistance on one of the challenges, implying that Shoka sent him their way. Whether Shoka also paid off Kai or simply asked for a favor as a friend, the bottom line is that Kai was willing to put his neck on the line to help Shoka get back at Shiba, a notably selfless move. Finally, though I wouldn't say that Shoka and Shiba ever appear to be friends in the same way that Shoka and the other three characters listed clearly are, she apparently trusted him enough to not completely rig the game if a team stronger than the Ruinbringers actually did come along. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so surprised at the Ruinbringers' constant appearances at the top of the scoreboard. I assure you that there was a point to that rather lengthy aside, which is that these bonds are what kept Shoka complacent in her position as a Shinjuku Reaper, much in the same way as how Minamimoto, Beat, and Neku made Rindo feel comfortable in taking a backseat to his role as the leader of the Wicked Twisters. Both exhibit a great degree of hesitation in taking action when they know that their needs can be cared for by other people. To further demonstrate the parallels between Rindo and Shoka's arcs, we can look at a number of their interactions during Week 2. Rindo, in giving Shoka via Swallow his frank thoughts on the goings-on of the Reaper's game, tells her that he feels the Ruinbringers' victory over them at the end of Week 1 was cheap. By then, he has begun to realize that the game is rigged against him. As we've already gone over, Shoka is frustrated for this. For example, on Week 2 Day 4, Shoka tells Beat that only those with power have any sway under the Shinjuku regime, only to then immediately out herself as one of those without power, exclaiming that Shiba has total rule over things before cutting herself off. Or on Week 2 Day 5, right after the Twisters' failure to overtake the Ruinbringers, where Shoka tells them to just give up, because they don't have a chance at winning. Undoubtedly a projection of her own thoughts, considering how her attempt at rigging the game in the player's favor fell flat on its face moments before. It even takes them both until all hope is lost to finally step up and take action. The only difference is that that moment happens a week earlier for Shoka than it does for Rindo. For one final talking point to wrap up this section, I wanted to discuss Motoi. Rindo and Shoka reference another a handful of times in their text interactions. It's not made entirely clear if Shoka is also an another fan, or if she just goes along with it for Rindo's sake, but she does appear visibly surprised when Motoi reveals that he is another during their confrontation on Week 2 Day 6. I personally chose to interpret this reaction as a sign of the former, because it would mean that Rindo and Shoka in that moment both overcome their deference to the same authority figure. Also, and this has absolutely nothing to do with the argument I've been making, but I just had to bring it up, there's this one moment that's really funny on replays, where Rindo corrects Shoka on the phrasing of another quote, not knowing that Swallow is Shoka, and just kind of picturing her on the receiving end of that message is very funny to me. Even funnier is that when Shoka parrots it back to Rindo later, she clearly copy-pastes Rindo's message so that she doesn't mess it up. You can tell it's copy-pasted because of the way it's written. Every character in Neo, and this is another detail I really like, has their own unique texting style, and the way it's phrased is exactly like Rindo's and not at all like Shoka's. And we've gotten way off track now, but I just had to point that out because I thought it was the funniest thing ever. Now that we've discussed the parallels between Rindo and Shoka's character arcs in detail, I want to talk more directly about their dynamic. If I can step out of video essayist mode for a second, Rindo and Shoka's dynamic is one of my favorite parts of Neo: The World Ends With You as a whole, in large part because of how the knowledge of Shoka being Swallow adds an entirely new layer to all of their interactions. Discussing that added layer was actually the original reason for making this video, before I ended up making the connection between their arcs while reviewing their shared scenes. As such, this section will probably be a bit less argumentative and more observational / conjecture based than the other two sections, as I just want to point out some scenes I found interesting upon second viewing. To start things off, I want to return to what I said earlier about Swallow lacking most of Shoka's attitude. Of course, there's a practical element here of not wanting to give away Swallow's identity right out of the gate, but looking past that, it seems odd that Shoka, who is usually uncompromising in terms of doing and saying whatever she wants, would choose to be so reserved over text. Returning to the other point I said I'd get back to, Kai suggests that Shoka, despite having friends among the Shinjuku Reapers, still feels a bit lonely, a point which Shoka retroactively affirms. Recognizing that she exists in this aforementioned Reaper hierarchy, she feels that the relationships she has with the other Shinjuku Reapers are conditional on her doing her job properly, and thus she feels like she is walking on thin ice around them. This is best exhibited through Shoka's interactions with Ayano, where, as previously stated, Shoka clumsily attempts to dance around the subject of her aiding the Twisters for fear of triggering someone who is supposedly like a sister to her. Thus, she turns to Rindo, or Rindragon, as an escape from the stresses of her daily interactions. She tones back the sass for fear of scaring him off, but of course, this isn't being true to herself either. That's why it isn't until she teams up with the Twisters directly that she declares herself lonely no more. I realize that explanation makes a number of claims that are at best only implied by the game itself, but it's the closest I could come to an answer that satisfied my confusion. That's all Shoka's side of things though. Briefly, I'd like to divert from the main topic of this video to talk about Rindo. Although initially Rindo and Shoka began chatting over their shared love of Fango, eventually their discussions turned to more serious topics. Rindo at one point mentions how he has asked Swallow for advice on multiple occasions in the past, indicating a level of openness and trust that Rindo doesn't even share with his fellow party members. Although Shoka is hesitant to open up about herself in the same way for obvious reasons, the aforementioned differences in the way she interacts with him versus how she interacts with everyone else demonstrates the sort of unspoken strength of their dynamic. It's that strength that makes me all the more curious about a particular set of scenes that happen, once again, during Week 2. Due to the lateness of Swallow's reveal within the overall narrative, much of the game utilizes a sort of reverse dramatic irony. By the time Rindo even begins to consider that Swallow might be in the game with him, Shoka has already figured out that Rindragon is actually Rindo. She has to have, otherwise the timeline of events wouldn't really make sense. Though the precise moment Shoka figures things out isn't clear, she definitely knows by the time they start talking about Nagi on day 3, so my personal theory is that she figures it out sometime during day 2. In any case, this means for the vast majority of the game, Shoka knows Rindragon's true identity, but Rindo and the player don't know Swallow's true identity. I bring all this up to highlight these aforementioned scenes during Week 2. As Rindo becomes more and more fed up with the apparent impossibility of victory, he begins to lash out at the nearest Reaper, Shoka, who Rindo of course has no idea is his best friend Swallow. We don't get any real indication as to how Shoka feels during these interactions, as in the heat of the moment she responds defensively by continuing to provoke Rindo, and she doesn't stick around long enough to give any sort of visual reaction that would indicate her feelings one way or the other. We know that later in the week is when she finally decides to take matters into her own hands, so you could try and make the claim that these arguments were the straw that broke the camel's back, what made Shoka finally give up her double life for good, but such an argument would be even more conjecture based on my theory on her differing personas. To be completely honest, there isn't a specific conclusion I can draw from these scenes. The game doesn't linger on them too much, so I doubt there's something the writers really wanted us to focus on. But I just had to point them out because they're perhaps the strongest example of the dramatic irony / reverse dramatic irony that makes the Shoka-Swallow juxtaposition so engaging. Further on the topic of Neo the World Ends With You's reverse dramatic irony, if you'll permit me to dive fully into conjecture for a moment. I like the idea that Shoka realizes how similar her and Rindo's frustrations are, and that those perceived similarities are specifically what led Shoka to defy the Shinjuku Reapers. It's not Rindo's presence alone specifically that makes Shoka act, Shoka just wanting to be a good friend that is, but rather Shoka realizing that she's not alone in her frustration. Shoka wanting to help Rindo and Shoka wanting to help herself are in essence the same thing, as they have the same problem. She'd be killing two birds with one stone. Again, sorry if this section was kind of rambly. Like I said at the start, most of these were more so observations I wanted to point out rather than points I had coherent arguments for. English teachers of years past might have derided my aimlessness or lack of confidence in said aimlessness, but this is my video essay, so I get to yap and then apologize for yapping all I want. I promise the next section will have more of a clear point. Speaking of which... On my first playthrough of Neo The World Ends With You, I thought the rule of Shinjuku Reapers having to be erased if they try to leave was just a contrived way to create some last-minute conflict, because I didn't believe that Shoka was actually going to die for a second. Sure, there was some pretty heavy-handed foreshadowing earlier, but the first game didn't have a sad ending, and there wasn't really anything to indicate that this game planned on changing that in any major way. On my most recent playthrough of the game though, I realized that that was not what that scene was trying to accomplish at all. In retrospect, it's actually kind of funny how I missed the point so thoroughly. It's tragic, really. Shoka had broken free from the Reaper's chain of command, already knowing what the consequences would be. Having been put down all her life, she had simply accepted that she wouldn't see the fruits of her labors. Much like the scenes with Rindo we discussed earlier, the game doesn't linger on this idea, but the implication means big things for Shoka's character. Since Shoka doesn't attempt to justify her decision besides saying that she doesn't want to be a Reaper and that she's made her peace, which is an incredibly morbid thing to say, there are a couple of different ways we can interpret this decision. My personal interpretation is that it's about control. As I touched on earlier, Shoka has never felt in control of her life. Her first big decision in joining the Reapers completely backfiring and ultimately putting her right back where she started. By the time the game starts, she's in a position where the chances of making any meaningful change from her current position seem slim. Seeing her friend Rindo enter the Reapers game, she finally decides to take matters into her own hands. In her mind, it's already too late for her, but at least she can help save the city she cares about. If she's going to go out, it's going to be on her own terms. Shoka may have never revealed her true identity to Rindo, or at least she never planned to, but she could take solace in the fact that they finally got to talk face to face and work together. She isn't proving anything to anyone but herself, but that's okay, because she never even had the opportunity to do that. This idea of control is yet another way in which Shoka's arc parallels Rindo's. If Rindo's arc is about accepting the responsibility that comes with making choices, Shoka's is about fighting for the freedom to make those choices. Ultimately, the concept of choice that Neo presents ties back into this larger series idea of individuality. The original game is about learning to grow, change, and better oneself through one's bonds. Neo is ultimately about the same thing, what with all of the monologuing about how important Shibuya is at the end of the game, but simply with this added layer of choices and how those choices impact not only yourself, but the people around you. Of course, no discussion of Neo The World Ends With You is complete without a discussion of its soundtrack. And so, as one final point before wrapping up this video, I'd like to cite a song. The World Ends With You as a series doesn't do character themes officially, but there are a number of songs that contextually match up with certain characters rather well. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to argue that Unconscious off of Neo's soundtrack could qualify as Shoka's theme. It plays during her first appearance in the story, and a number of the lyrics describe her current predicament before the game itself divulges any of the details. The speaker explains how they're quivering in the shadows, read Swallow, and bemoaning how life is so fleeting, which is what this entire section of the video has been about. Most relevant to this discussion, however, are the song's concluding lines, "I will show them who's in control in the end." If we take the speaker of this song to be Shoka, then this yearning for control matches up perfectly with the character motivations that I've just outlined. I realize this video may have seemed a bit unfocused at times, but I had a bunch of points I wanted to hit on, and ultimately I decided that I wanted to make one big video with my complete thoughts on Shoka in it, rather than have to leave stuff out in order to make a video more focused on how Shoka fits into Neo's larger narrative. Maybe that's objectively bad writing, but to me the video would feel incomplete otherwise. In my defense, this is my first video essay. I don't know how many more I plan on making after this, but I won't necessarily count it out either way. Unless things have changed since upload, this video is the only Shoka Sakurane character study on YouTube, which by default makes it the definitive Shoka analysis. If you disagree with what I've said here in this video and think I've wildly misinterpreted the character, I guess you'll just have to make your own video to try and outdo me. This is my way of goading the World Ends With You fandom into making more content on the series. This wasn't the reason I set out to make this video, but I've begun to notice that every time Neo is brought up by anyone outside of the active fandom, it'll only ever be in the context of, how come nobody played this, or I can't believe everyone forgot about this game so quickly. Then half of the replies will be in agreement, another small handful will blame it on Square's marketing, one or two commenters will blame it on the localization, and then everybody will forget about it again 2 hours later, only for the entire cycle to repeat in 3 months. I would never complain about the game getting more attention, since I think everyone who enjoys JRPGs should play it, but I do wish we got more people talking about the game itself, rather than making meta-analytical statements about how the game failed. I think there's a lot to analyze in terms of the actual writing, and I hope that more than anything else this video demonstrated that by taking a closer look at Shoka's character. Also, this isn't really related to anything else, but I would be remiss not to mention the fact that, while writing this script, The World Ends With You's official Twitter account did a cross-promotional April Fool's Day event. It wasn't much. I mean, I wasn't expecting a full new game, but I thought we might get a little piece of DLC or like a joke video or something. But it did inspire more hope in me as to the series' survival going forward than anything else that's happened since Neo's release. I mean, we got the Kingdom Hearts crossover 4 years after the original's release, so with this happening 3 years after Neo's, I feel fairly confident in saying that we're on track to get a third game within the next 10 years.